Welcome all to the Into the Pit special, where I will be breaking down and analyzing all three versions of the story. Guess what? They're all canon. Well, as long as you accept that the Stitch line is in the game's verse. If you go with that, I'll explain how the whole telling the same story 3 times works out into one trippy time loop narrative. Now, so I don't have to keep saying long titles over and over again, the game will refer to the game version of Into the Pit, the book to the original short story, and the interactive novel, or even just novel, for Return to the Pit, the new Choose Your Own Adventure book that just released. Before we can get to that, I am pleased to announce I have come to a conclusion about the one major thing that still confused me in the original presentation of the Stitch line. In episode 2, I was completely baffled by the fact that Larson found bloodstains in the ball pit that are implied to have been bled each time Eleanor claimed a victim. I thought the intended reading of the text was that it was Larson's blood from the future, the result of each time he passed through the ball pit in Eleanor's memories. But that reading threw everything into chaos. The ball pit isn't supposed to be actual time travel, and he's in Eleanor's mind. However, whoever added this bullet point to the speculation section of the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza Wiki on the article on the ball pit blew the case completely open for me. The blood samples are Eleanor tying the souls/minds of her victims to the ball pit. Even without the getting rid of time travel, this makes the most sense. Larson only sees a small selection of Eleanor's memories and doesn't travel through the pit every single time. However, there's a blood sample for every single one of Eleanor's victims. I didn't consider this myself because, well, Eleanor doesn't have any blood. But Larson thinks of Eleanor's agony tendrils as being blood. Agony could very well have a chemical composition close enough to blood that forensics can't tell the difference if they don't know what to look for. This still doesn't create a strict divide between agony and remnant. We don't really have any details about remnant as a physical substance. Heck, special delivery depicts it as orbs of light. But in the Stitch line, it's described as bubbling liquid mercury. Red blood cells are the marriage of iron, metal, and biological matter. That's the source of its smell and taste. The process of creating remnant, dying while in contact with metal, is typically going to involve bleeding on it. It seems like as a physical material, it involves the combination of organic matter and metal, although I will avoid going down the rabbit hole of what organic matter actually means in this context, as carbon is an extremely common ingredient in various alloys, and that's what actually makes something organic in a chemical sense. While the whole heat destroys remnant lore and the etching memories on metal part from the autobiography of the yogi seems to suggest that remnant involves storing memories through microscopic changes to the metal structure, just like how computer storage works. Taggart talking about homeopathy suggests another possibility. Other two pseudoscientific concepts Taggart refers to can easily be related to the idea of the zero-point field. They're all about human minds directly influencing the physical world. Homeopathy could also be a hint to how the Fnaf universe works. Since the process of dilution in homeopathy means that chemically there are no molecules of the substance remaining, its supporters have proposed that water has a memory, and past solutions are still able to influence its effects. This could be exactly how memory/essence is stored in the physical substance of remnant/agony. Metal melting can still destroy this extra material information, but this makes it less material than computer memory. I've previously not been as consistent as I should have been with using the term flip side as introduced in Fnaf World. It seems to be the setting-specific term for stuff like the spiritual realm. This would be the plane on which the extra molecular memory stored within remnant exists. It isn't a single continuous realm, probably. You can't reach Millie's snowy woods purely by moving through animatronica. Think of them like bubbles generated, each being still tethered to the physical realm through remnant. Actually, if you're familiar with Homestuck, dream bubbles are the best comparison, except you don't need to make a deal with an eldritch god for them to exist, and they're less bound to your specific memories. I know this is getting weird, but this esoteric talk will be relevant later. There's one problem with the blood Larson finds actually being Eleanor's agony. Since the forensic lab can date it, the red blood cells, and possibly other blood components that make it up, do decay normally from when Eleanor plants it. But for the lab to say that they all belong to the same person, they must contain DNA. Now, what I think actually happened is that Scott wasn't thinking this through enough to look up things like how accurately blood can be dated and for how long until bloodstains can no longer be tested. He probably just connected blood to agony from a general knowledge of iron being in blood. So looking up how forensic labs actually determine from whom a sample of blood comes from didn't occur to him. But I've also come up with a Watsonian explanation. Eleanor is someone's bones. Red blood cells are generated within the bones, and remnant could keep them alive and producing within her. As a physical component of agony, that helps with its generation. So the DNA of some random person is present within the agony. While I see To Be Beautiful as an inaccurate recounting of the events, Eleanor gathering Sarah's body parts does provide supporting evidence to this idea. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, it's time to focus back on Into the Pit. Since I'm going to assume most people are familiar with the game and the main theories about it, this won't be a normal summary. Instead, I'm going to focus on the main differences in story structure between the versions. The biggest difference is how the story starts. In the book, it begins on the last day of school. Oswald's dad proposes the whole library and Jeff setup that evening, which Oswald endures for a few weeks. When he does start to travel to 1985, he visits enough times for it to be a regular thing the day before the MCI. On the last day of summer, the MCI happens. His dad gets replaced by the Yellow Rabbit, which isn't as aggressive and does things like cook and drive Oswald to school. At school, Oswald meets Gabrielle, who tells him in detail about the Greek myths she's been reading, instead of giving him her grandfather's notebook. He sneaks out of the house that night and then saves his dad, the Yellow Rabbit being hung in the netting around the ball pit. The interactive novel primarily follows the short story over the game, but it does have a few changes. It begins at the start of summer, with Oz's dad proposing the library and Jeff's plan while he's driving Oz to the library. But Oswald goes into the pit on the second day. There's a scene that takes place in the book after Oz has known Mike and Chip for a few days when they're eating pizza, which is rewritten to take place after they've exchanged their tickets for prizes on Oz's first day. The next day is the MCI, and then things progress basically the same in the main ending. In the interactive novel, Oswald feels more like a three-dimensional character, instead of your generic middle-grade protagonist. His anger at the mundanity of his life is a lot more clearly communicated. I don't think this needs any in-universe explanation. It's just the difference between writing a short story and a 170-page novel, even if those pages aren't all linear. A good comparison is the Star Wars movies. Each one gets a comic, junior novelization, and a regular novelization. The novelization usually adds more content, but all of them vary in tiny ways. Yet they're broadly similar enough that there's no problem keeping them in the same continuity. In one fanfic I wrote, I had to rewrite a scene from The Last Jedi from an extra's perspective, and I had the comic movie and novelization all open while writing. Single lines are missing, ones that were probably filmed but didn't make it into the final edit. These tiny details don't make writing difficult, and when you get down to it, that's what canon and continuity are for. Creating a shared source material, fans, audience, official writers, all are on the same page when adding to the world and making theories. That's what I ascribe Oswald's different characterization to, but there are some differences that stick out enough that they require an in-universe explanation, as an example of this being an unstable simulation/time loop. My thesis for Into the Pit is that Oswald never makes it out. This allows for all three versions of the story to exist within the same continuity, they're just different loops. I'm assuming you've watched theories about how the game works and that the past isn't an accurate depiction of the MCI, but a reflection born from agony. I'm going to expand that to being the entire story. Oswald doesn't leave the pit. Sometimes he succeeds, and then he appears back at the start and has to do it all over again, with a shorter lead time. The only part of the three stories that take place within the physical realm is that of the original book, with its slower start until the MCI happened. Oswald is able to enter and leave the pit safely a handful of times, which is why Larson experiences no negative effects after entering it once in the physical realm, but too many times and Oswald doesn't make it out. His physical body dies at the bottom of the actual pit, having sucked all of his life force out. His dad is never grabbed, which explains why in the book and novel he straight up doesn't seem to have any memories of what was happening while the Yellow Rabbit had him, and in the game he's in an off-map room whose existence is never explained. Same with the rabbit taking him from that room to the pit for no reason. This works very well with Fazbear Frights' common story structure of a kid experiencing extremely disproportionate karma for their bad behavior and mindset. Oh, you wanted an exciting summer? Well, that's all you're ever going to have. I don't think this was the original intention for the story when it was first published, but as development on the game progressed, Scott decided to change the lore. There's evidence that the game was originally intended to be more of a trippy experience. There's a cut conversation with Old Man Consequences that you'd have a chance to trigger in the secret room in the hat collecting arcade game.
You fell down the rabbit hole, didn't you? It's not your fault. You didn't know. The others didn't know either. You were a little different from man. You know. You were not wrapped yet. Find solace in knowing such. Look to the sky or fall into the pit. The choice is yours.
The others sound like the souls Eleanor has trapped inside the ball pit. The world is different and not trapped, because instead of being placed there after his death, he's still alive. It's also interesting that this conversation was reached through the arcade games. While you can still play them in the past using tokens, the intended place to play them is repaired within the present. It also decreases the Ludonarrative Dissonance when Oswald isn't playing arcade games while being chased by the Yellow Rabbit, although it is possible you couldn't have played arcade games in the present when this scene was included in the game. but if you could have, it's evidence for Oswald not actually leaving the pit in the present section. Then the game was reworked to be less weird, getting more content by adding all these random kids you have to rescue, but the ideas were used to inspire Return to the Pit. That's why we've gotten an interactive novel for a fright story that already had a video game adaptation. And if I've learned anything from Giddy, it's that if a story mentions another piece of media, you need to look for what it says about motifs and themes and stuff. And the novel contains a completely new mention of Groundhog Day. You know, the famous time loop movie. Speaking of other people trapped in the pit, when Jake encounters Millie, she's experiencing something that didn't really happen, wandering lost and cold near her house. This represents her death at the hands of Funtime Freddy, or Eleanor in my theory. Cold is used as a motif for death and fear in countless ways. When Jake gives her her happiest day, it isn't by expanding a real memory like he did for the unhoused person. Instead, he creates a fictitious memory based on her desires. She gets to go inside and celebrate Christmas with the family she took for granted in life. And it is Jake's own happiest day that allows Andrew to move on. As for people being trapped inside a simulation slash dream slash memory, whatever inside the flip side, the simplest example is Jake neutralizing Eleanor within a terrible memory of hers. But the one you're thinking of is probably UCN. It doesn't just draw upon William's memories, but the memories of the crying child, the nightmares, Mike, the phantoms, and probably everyone who perished in the FNAF 6 fire to count for every single character in the game. Time Loop Hell is also a common reading of the week before. The normal canon path of the book leads to Ralph making none of the phone calls we know him for and dying in a different way. But after you reach that ending, you receive Bronwyn's phone and are supposed to go back to the book and use it in what seems to be the past. The usual reading is that Ralph is reliving his memories, able to keep his identity together better because he's an adult, and embellishing them with the phone calls he's actually making, as he's possessed Bronwyn's phone. But some people extend it and say that the different pathways of the novel are diegetic. Ralph is experiencing all these alternate ways his last week could have gone, with most of them leading to his brutal death. This could have even been intentional on the part of Cassidy, as she kills him in the normal ending. Ralph theorizes that him foiling the animatronics' plan to be able to leave the pizzeria has angered them. Specifically, he thinks that they'll become so aggressive that the next night guard won't be able to leave the security office, which is exactly what happens. If the regular animatronics are angry, then Cassie could have been too, and thus she is punishing Ralph. Later, I will get into the details, primarily in a novel that suggests this is all a simulation in the flip side. But the structure of Return to the Pit suggests a time loop as well, especially if that's also Ralph's fate. You see the same game over text when you reach a bad ending. The novel also has its own secret ending, requiring to use a token that you acquire at the end of your adventure. Once you acquire it, Oswald then plays a game called 8-Bit Escape. Whenever you get a game over in this section, Oswald perceives himself as respawning at the start of the game. But the section is full of repeated passages, indicating that while Oswald experiences continuity when he dies inside the arcade game, he loses his memories, just like when he dies outside of the game, which is presented as a game over rather than a bad ending. Just like UCN, whether he wins or loses, he still has to repeat it all over again. In the secret ending, he saves the MCI kids from the Yellow Rabbit by bringing cake to them. When he comes to, he's in the present, a present where the MCI didn't happen. Jeff's is revitalized, similar to the best ending of the game, and he's with his family. I present to you that this is Oswald's happiest day, granted to him by Jake. Just like Millie, this isn't something that really happened. There are several reasons, any combination of which could be true, that explains why Jake can't just show up and lead Oz to his happiest day. The first is that since Oswald didn't die before entering the pit, he won't just accept Jake appearing and follow him to his happiest day. The second is that Oswald requires a more elaborate happiest day. Millie just regretted being in a different place where she got killed, so Jake just had to lead her home. Oswald needs this extremely traumatic event he just saw to have not happened, his town to be less of an economic dead end, and to be with his family. Third is that Jake's own sense of self has started to dissolve. When he enters the pit, the Stitchwraith's body's battery is damaged and seems to be leaking remnant. Becoming a psychopomp to all the souls in the ball pit could have untethered him from his unusually strong self-perception. Now he can't just manifest and lead people to his happiest day. He has to manipulate their prisons to become them. While the game is full of Easter eggs you have to ignore for the game to exist in any continuity, which is still the case for most of them, especially those referring to the future, stuff that isn't related to Eleanor's other victims, there is one that this theory lets into the lore. The Stitchwraith will appear in Oz's window if you've idled in his bedroom for 10 minutes. That itself is interesting. It's a hidden secret instead of just a sprite in the background. In the real world, in the Stitch line, they don't have any reason to be spying on Oswald. But in this theory, it's Jake trying to figure out how to break the dream to let Oz move on. And of course, Oz's own actions in the arcade Bringing the MCI kids to a cake references the original Happiest Day. The interactive novel features a branch of the story which people have termed the Avengers Path, where Oz teams up with an adult Chip, his daughter Gabriella, and a bunch of random adults to take down the Yellow Rabbit. Except the leader of the group is also the Yellow Rabbit, and every single ending goes terribly for them. This has people freaking out, as Chip knowing who Oswald is suggests actual time travel. But if Oswald never makes it out of the pit, this is all completely plausible. This section of the video will go over the internal contradictions within the novel that exist even if you accept that the pit is an actual time machine. Because, in reality, the pit is just making it up as it goes along, drawing from Oswald's knowledge of movies. To start with, Chip is extremely vague about what happened to him in the 30-odd years since the MCI. He speaks vaguely of knowing other kids who have used the ball pit to also go into the past, but never explains how he knows who the Yellow Rabbit is. Chip seems to remember things exactly how Oswald experienced it, but all the kids getting killed at once in such a dramatic way goes against what we know about the MCI and the gamesverse. How does the Yellow Rabbit get from pretending to be your dad to pretending to be their leader? This leader is never named. Gabriel uses it pronouns for it, despite not being able to see its true forms. What is the time frame in which the team has been assembled? What are the other time jumps? In the Avengers route, Chip doesn't act like he's moved to Oswald's town. Gabriel is with the team instead of in school. But if Oswald doesn't try to run away from the Yellow Rabbit, he sees Gabrielle at school, where she acts basically the same as she did in the novel. Why isn't she with her dad? It wouldn't be influenced by Oswald's choices. Outside of the Avengers route, Chip's team doesn't attack Jeff's Pizza, another thing that wouldn't be affected by Oswald's choices. Unless everything is being formed around Oswald as he makes his decisions. Recycling Gabriel, someone the pit made up or copied from another person's memories, to play different roles depending on what Oswald does. This is why Chip never brings up that his dad was a Freddy's technician, and why Gabrielle is so quick to give Oswald a notebook of historical importance. The path where Oswald runs out of the house also includes an ending where his neighbor is replaced by Chica. Again, doesn't make sense unless this is all a dream bubble. Everything being a simulation inside the ball pit also helps to resolve some of the weird stuff in the game version. All the kids in the pizzeria that Oswald has to save, which never really feel like they're in actual danger of dying, just being an extremely inconvenience, are challenges the pit is putting in front of Oswald to keep him from finding his dad so quickly in this loop. So why they can just walk out of there once they've been rescued. This isn't something that strengthens my theory, as everyone accepts that the past sections are symbolic, but not accurate reflections of the past. However, there's also stuff in the present section of the game that makes more sense if it is also a vision. What phone calls you can make isn't restricted by what time period Oswald is. Not that he should even get service in the past, but you can call Jeff's Pizza every night from the past section, and then on night 5, the game's phone guy picks up, even if you're calling from the present. It's also how Oswald is able to travel between each location when he needs his dad to drive him to and from the pizzeria, even in the game. The pit is just cutting out the interstitial bits. The book versus novel also changes Oswald's transportation method. In both, Pit Trap drops him off at school, which makes sense with how dependent Oswald has been to be driven around to get places in his town during the summer. But in the novel, the Yellow Rabbit picks him up again, and in the book, he just takes the bus. In the novel, Oswald being so confused that no one else can see the rabbit is redundant, as it also happened when he was dropped off. That said, it is a good way to keep the tension high. But lore-wise, how Oswald gets around town isn't important because it isn't actually happening. The novel also explicitly draws attention to how weird it is that in a dying town, Jeff's Pizza is open late at night, something that is present in the original short story. Everything is a simulation also explains why the Yellow Rabbit bursting the doors open causes damage in the present. During the present section of the same night, it has a caution sign, but then it goes away the next day, although the doors remain unprepared. The simulation is struggling to keep the past and present versions separate. The big one is how you get the good ending in the game. You need to gather all of Dad's stuff, each of which inspires a good memory in Oswald. Somehow, this causes a photo of Henry and William to appear. In the long version of the simulation, the pit doesn't want to give Oswald a victory in this loop, no matter what, which is why you suddenly get dragged back down into the pit for no good reason if you don't have the photo. It's only by connecting to his own memories that Oswald is able to influence the simulation to give him a win this time. Then there's the perfect ending, requiring you to not just repair all of the arcade machines, which, mind you, would give Jeff some money to help improve his establishment, but you also have to play all of the secret minigames and beat the arcade games. I'll get to explaining the secret 8-bit minigames later, but I do want to point out that in the arcade game you have to beat, included is a game called Save the Children, where you have to leave 4 kids out of a maze away from the yellow rabbit. This isn't a game that makes sense to exist in-universe. More evidence that even the present is a simulation. It's an early version of Jake trying to manifest 8-bit escape. And the best ending of the game is an adaptation of the secret ending from the novel. The part about the MCI not happening is removed to make the game less wacky. Obviously, this stuff alone isn't evidence for even the present section being inside the pit. That would be stupid. All games are full of stuff where mechanics don't entirely match the story. It's called Ludonarrative Dissonance. But I do think this works as supporting evidence when there's a main argument to build off from. In this section, I'd like to go over some small differences between the different versions that don't fit into the main plot differences I discussed earlier. Now, this isn't really evidence per se, but I want to go over these anyway, and how they can be explained by signs of the pit struggling to maintain a simulation of such complexity, and the general idea that things are going to change each route, because even though Oswald isn't remembering his previous loops, chance is going to cause him to make different choices. That kind of idea of non-deterministic behavior, that an Oswald with the same memories won't make the same choices, fits in with the idea of quantum uncertainty that relates to the scientific explanation of the zero-point field. First is Oswald's phone. In the book and novel, he actually owns a phone, like the old phone you have in the game. It's actually so important that for no clear reason you have to text your friend like Oswald does in the book, otherwise you get the ending where you try to avoid the pit and end up in a life without meaning. In the game, the phone belonging to your dad just gives you a little bit of an extra challenge, a light introduction to the sneaking out of the house mechanic before you call your mom to end the night, and that's essentially what I think the pit was doing, making Oz's life just a little bit harder. If Outside the Pit wasn't also a simulation, the Yellow Rabbit would have had to be doing Oz's dad's job during the day, and him not having a phone is liable to cause difficulties. It also makes a lot of sense for Oswald to have his own phone, given how much he is left unsupervised, and how contemporary Into the Pit, a topic I will be exploring more later, is supposed to be. This change is evidence that the pit can manipulate Oswald's own memory in minor ways, causing him to forget that he owns his own phone. One very weird difference is Oswald's order in the book versus the novel. There's no plot difference here. It doesn't ramp up the tension or facilitate the interactive format. Return to the Pit will copy passages from the novel verbatim, so I think this random change is to show how things can be different for no clear reason. This isn't a stable, causality-based exploration of alternate possibilities. It's a dream that's barely holding itself together. Basically a glitch to be noticed when comparing all 3 versions. Similarly, in the book, Oswald receives a normal dinner made by Pit Trap, who somehow knows what food he likes. While in the novel, it's made from emergency supplies, where the uncanny part is how unlike Oswald's dad, the Yellow Rabbit, is behaving. The book is basically the perfect loop, happening early in the process before the dream begins to deteriorate. In the novel, Pit Trap is more aggressive outside of the pit, and even more so in the video game. Oswald is also able to make different choices even without player intervention. In the novel, he openly feeds Jinx some milk, while in the book, he pretends it's for him. The novel also cuts out the conversation about a movie I assumed to be The Force Awakens, which I relied upon for dating the story. Instead of watching a science fiction movie, they watch a rom-com, because they can't stop arguing, which is exactly what the mom threatens to do in the book. So the novel is depicting counterfactual to the book, even without player intervention. Final book/novel change, which isn't specifically related to when the story is supposed to be set, which I'll get to later, is how Oswald describes the kids watching the animatronics when he first enters Freddy's. Genuine joy is replaced by uncanniness as the simulation becomes more strained. There are also interesting ways in the game differ, separate from their different plot structure. There are 2 choices where what happens is exactly the opposite of what happens in the game. If you try to climb out the window, Oswald just straight up slips and dies. The fact it's explicitly something you can do in the game increases the feeling of things being random and changing separately from Oswald's own actions. The other one is what happens when you use your flashlight on the yellow rabbit. Instead of temporarily stunning it, it falls back and seems to get spring-locked, even though there isn't actually a human body inside. Then instead of falling back on one of the bad endings where Oswald gets lost in the pit or drifts apart from his dad over time, the usual ways diverging from the plot is punished, the ball pit is straight up gone. The ball pit being replaced by a birthday cake is also what happens in the secret arcade path. In this loop, Oswald has just broken the simulation, and thus it has no choice but to shut things down. Speaking of errors in the simulation, here's more no real time travel evidence. Specifically, there are things that indicate the pit is creating 1985 from what left an impression in the Freddy's location in Oswald's own memories. It is confirmed to be June 1985 in the game, and the newspaper in Fnaf 1 also gives a date in June for one of the disappearances. But in the game, you can overhear a conversation about kids being excited to watch Ghostbusters at a new movie in the theaters. But Ghostbusters came out in 1984, the previous year. Mike's favorite movie in the book isn't coming out until next month, and he says it only came out a few weeks ago in the game. The kids are accurately able to say that Oswald's reference to E.T. came out about 3 years ago, and their conversation about a stand-in for the never-ending story is about a movie from '84. It is mushing together the various echoes that have been left in this Freddy's and Oswald's knowledge of the '80s, but it can't be perfectly accurate. Now, I'll admit that since Fnaf isn't set out to make hard-hitting historical fantasy as much as I wish it was, these inaccuracies aren't massive pieces of evidence, but they are more minor points to add to the pile. Something more prescient is how time passes in the supposed real world in the stories. In the book, Oswald spends what seems like weeks hanging out with his friends in the '80s before the MCI happens on his last day of summer. In the novel, we see when Oz's dad initially proposes the idea of Oz going to Jeff's after the library, and it feels like the beginning of summer. Yet after only 2 days of him going into the ball pit, it's suddenly the end of summer, and a narration explicitly acknowledges this weirdness. The game presents itself as well in the summer, but Oswald's frustration with life doesn't seem to have reached levels of "it's the very last day of summer and I've done nothing fun." Instead, it sneaks up on you. Ball pit is fuzzing out the summer break, where Oswald is likely to encounter unfamiliar things, so you can get back to the familiarity of school. And speaking of familiarity, Oswald is supposed to have started middle school the new school year, but it certainly doesn't feel like it. There's no, "oh no, I have to start a new school with greater expectations, and at the same time I have to get my dad back" stress. In the game, it doesn't even feel like he started a new grade. It's all the same people, and in the novel, even the same material. The pit can't generate something either it or Oswald hasn't seen. So just like it did with the cell phone, it obscures his memories and presents his elementary school as his middle school. It even has a playground and recess, which while I can't speak for every single school, is generally no longer a thing in middle school. The same limitation is shown in the extended version of the ending where Oswald just leaves the pizzeria. After one small detour I'll get to later, Oswald perceives time speeding up until he's back in the present, but having aged. This is because neither Oswald nor the pit really has a good idea of what the outside world looked like in the '80s, so it takes Oz back to the present. Then it does the same hand wave, "oh, you've met a terrible fate," skipping past anything Oswald could do to prove his identity, like demonstrating exclusive knowledge or getting a DNA test, that it does when Oz refuses the call and is put on a path of estrangement from his father. Now for the detour. The one thing Oz can do in the '80s is encounter a doll who may be Eleanor, who seems to be in cahoots with the Yellow Rabbit. But she's described as a doll rather than a mannequin or endoskeleton, and looks like a small girl instead of an adult woman. Going off of my theory about Eleanor being the game's version of the trilogy version of Baby, the intended adult body for Charlie Emily, then this is Charlie's intended body from when the MCI happened. It is separate from Ella. We never see its true form. Charlie was in the same grade level as one of the MCI kids, and Oswald also thinks of their bodies as dolls at first. Given my theories that in the game's verse, Henry was never able to successfully recreate his daughter, this body wasn't out doing anything, but Eleanor would have known of her. Eleanor has also imparted her memories onto the pit. It knows one thing about the '80s, so it creates this representation of her. I can't say if this body is being directly controlled by Eleanor or it's just a reflection of her personality. Now that everything is inside the pit, the idea of Eleanor piloting the Yellow Rabbit outside of the pit is no longer relevant. A big question that remains is if this is the Freddy's the MCI happens in. Seems obvious, doesn't it? The ball pit captured the agony of the MCI and all the other messed up stuff that happened in the location. Ultimately, I do agree, but I want to go over some possible challenges to the idea. Let's start with the layout. They're quite different, but Fnaf 1 isn't the prime Freddy location during the MCI. It is specifically a smaller version. The week before includes the detail that the building is actually much bigger, with more than just the secret storeroom being blocked off. They move the walls around, and there are even accessible rooms without a working camera in them. This seems like such a weird detail to include when just looking at the week before in the games, especially with the walls being moved around and the abandoned section. Now, the off-camera rooms give you more space to use for storytelling, no problem there. But it is perfect for explaining the different layout between Into the Pit and Fnaf 1. This isn't the kind of explanation you could use to demonstrate exactly how things change. You have to keep in mind that Into the Pit is a 2D game, and part of suspension of disbelief is accepting that you aren't seeing a 100% accurate depiction of the environment. Things are moved around to facilitate the player's ability to navigate and understand the setting from their fixed perspective. But it does cover the two big elements of the Into the Pit pizzeria that is missing in Fnaf 1. The ball pit and the arcade. Those are in the section that had been blocked off. Phasma Entertainment might not realize that the ball pit is extremely dangerous, but they would still need to sanitize it to keep it open to the public. And a functioning arcade means more maintenance costs than stocking a prize counter. In the novel, there's an extra detail that the arcade is actually part of a different building than the present. But what about in the game, you might ask? When Oswald is in a game-based loop, Jeff's Pizzeria is being created based on a guess, and so it contains errors. Makes no sense for Jeff to have this whole extra unused room. Why not even sell broken arcade cabinets? And why didn't Fazbear Entertainment take it when they sold the location, like they did with all the animatronic parts? The same applies to the party room in the present. That's why none of the Freddy stuff has been removed. The only aspect I don't feel satisfied with is the pit being in a different room, but only in the game version. For this one, I'm going to go with a separate ball pit room being canon to all three versions of the story. It's what makes the most sense, as then it can be sealed up during Fnaf 1, and since it wasn't the secret storage room, something with how the location was subdivided when it was sold means that the room was opened up. Or maybe Eleanor opened it herself for easier access, which is how Larson can find it easily in her memories when the location is abandoned. Changing this aspect of the book and novel story may involve contradicting the text, but it doesn't really break anything. Oswald just got bored and started exploring the pizzeria. Somewhere like Papa Bear's Pancake House, just having a dirty ball pit out in the open doesn't make a lot of sense. Then there's the matter of determining if Oswald's town is Hurricane, Utah. Before Into the Pit was woven into the Stitch line, I was convinced that Into the Pit was in-universe fiction. And part of that is that Hurricane is a tourist town due to its proximity to Zion National Park. This isn't deep hurricane lore, it's right there on the Wikipedia page. Freddy's being built in a tourist town makes a lot of sense, explaining how it exists and is popular enough to have a TV show despite having only limited locations. People come to the area for the national park and so take their kids to Freddy's while they're there. In both the game and the book, Oswald's schools are named Westbrook Elementary and Westbrook Middle School, suggesting that that is the name of his town. From the flag in the game, we can still confirm that we're in Utah, but as far as I could find, there was no school or town in Utah named Westbrook. I think what happened here is that between the Silver Eyes trilogy and Fazbear Frights, Scott changed his mind about using real locations, perhaps wanting to avoid people in these small towns getting annoyed when a massive fandom is suddenly interested in them. The Silver Eyes trilogy is full of concrete location details. Not just does most of it take place in Hurricane, it also references the nearby towns of St. George and New Haven in a way that is broadly accurate to the basic facts about them. But all the Fright stories are very cagey about where they explicitly take place. Even the ones that reference other locations make a point to avoid naming the main town it takes place in. Fnaf 6 only tells us that the game takes place in Washington County, not a specific town. The way things stand today, it seems to be just as accurate to state that Fnaf takes place primarily in Westbrook, Washington County, Utah, as to say it takes place in Hurricane. Return to the Pit does something really interesting. It fixes an anomaly even the game still has and depicts only 5 MCI kids. Going with my hypothesis that Into the Pit wasn't intended to be this trippy when it was first written, I think the 6th kid was originally meant to be Andrew. But then Scott realized that introducing an extra kid like that would be weird, and so changed it so he was killed by someone else. That is why so much of Andrew and the man in room 1280 parallels UCN, but Scott communicated something to Andrea Wagoner that led to her writing Arthur Blythe to ask for a phone book and didn't tell her to look at a picture of Scraptrap and describe what he looked like after a fire and surgical removal of all of his animatronic parts to come up with the appearance of the man. I'll explain this more in my first video. So, if the 6th kid is no longer Andrew, who are they? They're a representation of all the times Oswald has ended up as one. Most of the bad endings fit into 3 main categories. Basically, the Yellow Rabbit's jump scare from the game, Oswald gets hit by a car, and Oswald becomes an MCI kid. There are so many different ways to reach such an end. 2 separate times the Yellow Rabbit tries to lure him there. The novel establishes that the party hats Oswald sees the victims wearing in the book make the kids docile in both the arcade and the supposed real world. Clarification of the different ways William lured the kids into the back room. This happens to Oswald a lot of times and is also the pity party ending of the game. An ending I'll remind you is something extremely easy to get on one's first playthrough. There's also an ending where you become one of the animatronics, like the MCI kids. In this theory, Oswald's singular linear experience in the pit is a mixture of each version. He experiences the extra long introduction of the book in the real world. Then he sees a 5-person MCI from the novel. He becomes an MCI kid a lot of times, sometimes even before the MCI happens in this loop. Now he sees either the MCI from the book or the game in his next loop. He could be switching between 1-night and 5-night versions of the loop. The pit starts making up kids to give him more chances to be traumatized after he saved his dad too quickly once or twice, or the pit starts to cut content out once it begins to break down, either as a natural result of the side effects of direct pit absorption or because Jake is trying to break it. The scene where Oswald picks up the golden token could happen either after a game or a book-style ending. In the files of the game, there are scraps of a children's drawing depicting the MCI. This suggests that in an older version of the game, one of Oswald's extra objectives was needing to convince the spirits of the MCI kids that Yellow Rabbit is the one who killed them, just like in the movie In the Fourth Closet. Again, more evidence that an older version of this plot was more trippy. The interesting part is that the complete version in the files includes 5 kids, count 6 kids in the version of the cutscene in the final game. Line up with the games vs. MCI kids. 3 boys and 2 blonde girls. One girl has curls, Susie, and one has short hair, Cassidy. But when you assemble the pieces present in the game files, you have a 6th kid. This 6th kid has brown hair and resembles Oswald. Unlike the other kids, his hands are up and his mouth is clearly open. The other 5 kids are laying down prone on the ground, just drawn without perspective. The 6th kid is Oswald in shock, seeing the murder. This also lines up with the arcade game where you gather 5 hats, even though the cutscene in the game features 6 dead kids. To get the cis hat, you have to travel off the screen where the purple guy actively gives you the final hat, just like the yellow rabbit does in a lot of bad endings. I suppose now I have to get to what the secret 8-bit minigames are. Fortunately for me, they all depict something different from how I actually think these stories occurred. I just want to dismiss them as non-canon Easter eggs like so many things in the game, but since they're secrets you have to discover, in the form lore is normally delivered, and are required for the best ending, I can't just do that. But it is important to know that these minigames were originally about putting Foxy back together, and then something about Vanny following Purple Guy's orders. This suggests to me that they were supposed to be fun Easter eggs rather than lore clues, but were changed to better fit the topic and not drive us crazy about if this means Glitch Trap counts as William. The first minigame is based extremely loosely on Fetch, where you play as someone who is maybe Greg, traveling around to Freddy's gathering balloons and then getting mauled by Fetch. This has nothing to do with what actually happens in the story. If you wanted to communicate the story as an 8-bit minigame, it would have made far more sense for the player to be controlling Fetch and have us pick up increasingly disturbing things. An alternate interpretation of this game is that it's Andrew getting killed by Fetch and possessing him. The presence of Golden Freddy is supposed to indicate this to us, although Andrew's connection to Golden Freddy is via fan expectations rather than actual lore. While I love more evidence for Andrew being killed by someone other than William, it breaks my old theory about what Fetch is and how it got into the pizzeria while creating all these new questions, like why did Fetch attack Andrew? What was it designed to do? And how did Andrew come to possess his killer? The next 2 minigames present the opposite problem for me, as they accurately represent To Be Beautiful in countless ways, including details I declared were made up by the in-universe Fazbear Frights writer, as the version of events we get to read are a fictionalization of real ones. One for To Be Beautiful, you control Eleanor remaking Sarah's body until she turns into trash. The Ways game includes symbols representing all of the deaths Funtime Freddy offered her, and then she dies touching Bon Bon, which is an interesting symbol to use instead of an entire Funtime Freddy model, as this specific version is lacking his hand puppet. While this isn't the most satisfying, my ultimate interpretation is that these games represent how the other dream bubbles from Eleanor's other victims, as well as the memories of Andrew/Fetch and/or Kimberly's remnant, are imposing upon Oswald's world. We aren't supposed to look too closely at the details. They won't help us understand the stories they represent. They're just presenting the concept and are an alternative to us getting super confused about Vanny. Fortunately, the final question about Into the Pit, I am unable to provide an answer for. I previously said that it is set in early 2016, when Force Awakens is available for rental. The conversation Oz and his dad have are vague enough that there are more movies it could be about, or it could be about something exclusive to the Fnaf universe. But there are details changed in the novel that are modernizations, indicating that Scott intended this to take place after 2019, when the book was being written, but couldn't include details to communicate this information. Oswald adds TikTok to his list of things the 80s doesn't have. The platform didn't exist under that name until 2017 and really only took off in 2020. This is only in one version of the passage, but that's probably an error since it's directly copied from the original book. Given the week before also has a pretty big error, I feel like Scholastic doesn't have editors that are specifically trained for interactive novels. Wish they'd at least patch the ebook copy so we'd know what's actually important. Family Fun Night, Oswald's family is now getting their movie through a streaming app, reflecting the increased prominence of streaming over DVD rental, even for poor families, what with there being free ad-supported platforms, as well as how dirt cheap smart televisions have become. The problem about these modernizing changes is that it moves into the pit after FNAF 3 and possibly even FNAF 6. but the timeline placement of the Stingers and their contemporaneous stories is based on the lack of online gaming by young kids in the real Jake, anachronistic for its 2020 release date. The description of Jeff's pizza doesn't actually require the establishment to have been closed. The place does just suck, and Jeff is around to let Larson in. But if Into the Pit takes place after the Stingers, the question then becomes, why couldn't Jake prevent Oswald from getting trapped in the pit in the first place if he now lives there? The best explanation I can come up with is that Jake has completely lost control of his physical body, the result of the Stitchwraith being shot and leaking remnant when he entered the pit. He now exists only on the flip side, similar to the god/spirit interpretation of Old Man Consequences. Eleanor has created an extremely powerful cursed artifact. He found Millie first because she was the easiest to set free. Trying to give the at least 30 people trapped in the pit their happiest day is hard work, and he never expected to have to protect Oswald from being consumed by the pit. Perhaps Jake never even realized that could happen until Oswald was already too far gone. If the pit were to be carefully physically excavated, they would find Oswald's desiccated corpse and the unpowered remains of the Stitchwraith. Thank you for watching this video. This theory is something I'm very proud of. Up there with the theories in the first video where I put forth the claim that Andrew is in the Gamesverse but wasn't killed by William Afton. I am extremely grateful to anyone who has taken the time to watch my videos, but I must announce that I will not be making more videos. Yes, there are more stories to analyze, which you can see on the screen, but I don't have any theories to connect the remaining stories. It would just be me recapping them and declaring them in-universe fiction or not. The best I got is that a lot of these involve people being replaced, but I have no ideas about what to put forth about what that means. While it isn't like I expected to go viral overnight, the lack of comments is making it feel like I'm putting all this work into the void for no one to see it. Maybe I'll pick up this series again during another break, but for now you can find me yapping in the comment sections of various Fnaf theorists. Absol out.